Well, on behalf of the Brewer Foundation and New York University, I am pleased to welcome you to the first semifinal debate of the 20th Annual International Public Policy Forum. As I hope you all know, my name is Andrea Sadberry. I'm the IPPF Executive Director. The IPPF is the first and only competition that gives high school students from around the world the opportunity to engage in written and oral debates on issues of public policy. This year, more than 180 teams representing schools in 19 countries and 25 US states submitted qualifying round essays on the topic Resolved: The Benefits of Artificial Intelligence Outweigh the Harms. Judges determined the top 64 teams who entered into a written debate tournament involving essays back and forth via email. The process continued for several rounds until the Elite 8 teams were named. The quarterfinals debates took place last night, and actually one is wrapping up right now. At this time, we'll begin the first semifinal debate with the Hockaday School from Dallas, Texas, competing against Montgomery Blair High School from Silver Spring, Maryland. At this time, I'd like to invite our debaters to introduce themselves. Let's begin with the Affirmative Team from Montgomery Blair.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Shahryar Vazgami. I'm a senior at Montgomery Blair High School, and I'm happy to be the first speaker today for Blair.
My name is Alex Jang. I'm also a senior from Montgomery Blair High School, and I will be the second speaker today.
I'm Jonathan. Oh, sorry, my video just froze. I'm Jonathan. I am a junior at Montgomery Blair, and I am delighted to be the third speaker on the Affirmative Team today.
Now let's turn things over to the Negative Team from the Hockaday School.
Hi, I'm Mia Shaw. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm a senior at the Hockaday School, and I'll be the first speaker today.
My name is Naz. She, her pronouns as well, please, and I'll be the second speaker for Hockaday.
My name is Cassie Liu. I'm a junior at Hockaday, and my pronouns are she, her, and we're really excited to be debating y'all today.
Welcome, guys. Congratulations for making it into the first semifinal. Now we're going to introduce our moderators and judges for this round. Serving as our moderator for this debate is Mr. David Baker. Mr. Baker was appointed in 1984 as coach of the St. Mark's debate team. He coached debating and taught public speaking for 16 years prior to his appointment as the Director of Admission and Financial Aid at St. Mark's. Under his direction, the St. Mark's debate program was named one of the 10 most successful programs of the 20th century and won the high school national championship in 1990. In 2003, he was elected to the National Speech and Debate Association's Hall of Fame. In 2006, he was named to the Texas Forensic Association Hall of Fame. And he's been involved in the IPPF since its formation 20 years ago. Our semifinal judges include Mr. Trey Smith. He is the principal and head administrator at East Mountain High School. He is the former New Mexico district chair of the National Speech and Debate Association. Mr. Smith has coached multiple teams to the Elite 8 rounds of the IPPF and was the author of the 2018-19 IPPF topic primer. A two-diamond coach with the NSDA, Mr. Smith has coached over 90 students to the national tournament, including multiple national finalists. In 2026 and 2027, he looks forward to hosting the National Speech and Debate Tournament in Albuquerque after the 2020 tournament was canceled due to the pandemic. Ms. Maggie Berthum is the Director of Debate at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. As the director at Woodward, she has coached the NDCA national champions and the champions and finalists of numerous national tournaments, including St. Mark's, the Barclay Forum for High Schools, Greenhill, Carrollton Sacred Heart, and Westminster, and the top speaker at the NDCA Net Championship and the Tournament of Champions. Her teams have 6 times won the Georgia State Championship. Ms. Berthum debated for Dartmouth College, where she reached the quarterfinals of the NDT, the semifinals of the SETA Nationals, and received 2 first-round at-large bids to the NDT. She is a 2012 inductee to the Key Coaches of the Barclay Forum at Emory University, a 2021 inductee to the Georgia Forensic Coaches Association Hall of Fame, and the 2016 Georgia Coach of the Year. Mr. Alex Puy is the current Vice President Finance of Europe for the world's largest brewer, Anheuser-Busch InBev, and is based out of Brussels, Belgium. Mr. Puy was an award-winning high school debater at the Alexander W. Dreyfus Junior School of the Arts in Florida. With his help, his team won the IPPF in 2006 and 2007. He now heads the IPPF Circle of Champions, our alumni organization, and is a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. Now with that, I will turn things over to Mr. Baker.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you and congratulations. on your success. I'd like to remind our judges and team members to stay on mute unless you are speaking or preparing to speak. Of course, cross-examinations, all members should be unmuted during that time. Each of you has received a copy of the oral debate format, and I want to let you know that while I'll be timing speeches, I'm not going to be announcing time, so I assume everyone has a timing device so that you'll have the same time in front of you that I do, and I won't stop you unless you run over time. So you're not going to receive signals from me, and I assume everyone has something to time with. So with that, we will begin with the first affirmative opening speech for a period of 8 minutes, and you may begin when ready.
Does everybody hear me well? Excellent. I'll start my time now. In 2010, 3 London researchers united to teach a computer how to play video games, simple ones like Pong and Space Invaders. The artificial intelligence program quickly learned the rules of the games without any prior knowledge, leading the researchers to wonder whether they could transform it into a general purpose AI that could tackle the world's challenges, both big and small. Over 10 years and 1 Google acquisition later, this AI has learned to identify biomarkers for breast cancer, optimize the use of energy in data systems, and model complex processes like protein folding. DeepMind, an 11-year-old startup creating the most innovative solutions to the world's most perplexing challenges, is what AI is all about. Today, my partners and I are proud to affirm the resolution. The benefits of artificial intelligence outweigh the harms. AI systems like DeepMind are improving quality of life worldwide. One of the key benefits of these systems is enabling humans to reach new heights in healthcare. AI is increasing drug development while improving preventative health measures, both of which have the potential to improve health outcomes for billions. COVID-19 highlights the importance of continued medical innovation. Unfortunately, there is an innovation problem in the status quo. A report by Deloitte finds that out of every 10,000 molecules, only 10 make it to clinical trials. Out of those 10, only 1 even passes phase 1. As the law of diminishing return takes its toll, innovation will only decrease as research into new drugs becomes more and more prohibitively expensive. Fortunately, AI is poised to reverse this trend by augmenting existing medical capabilities and creating new ones. AI enables medical researchers to analyze larger data sets in shorter amounts of time, improving the efficiency and efficacy of drug development. That's why a study by Deloitte finds that discovery stages and preclinical investigations are up to 15 times faster while employing AI. Additionally, AI can also create entirely new drugs at superhuman speeds. For example, AI algorithms formulated a new drug that treats patients with compulsive disorders in just 12 months. This stands in stark contrast to the standard 5-year drug development process. Luckily, the benefits of AI will spill over into every medical field. As Professor Hopkins puts it, the beauty of the algorithm is that it is agnostic, so it can be applied to any disease. Drug development is of utmost importance, as from 1986 to 2000, new drugs were responsible for 40% of the increase in life expectancy globally. Beyond drugs, AI allows for the detection and treatment of chronic diseases with high precision. For example, AI can already outperform doctors in diagnosing breast cancer. And more importantly, AI is enabling the development of new capabilities to assess risk of developing a chronic disease. Early detection is the most effective method for reducing deaths from the chronic disease, which account for 70% of all deaths in the US and tens of millions annually worldwide. AI's impact in healthcare is just a microcosm of its future role in society. The same data analytics technology used to examine medical data can be used to increase the level of autonomy by which a vehicle operates and maintain the safety of global food supplies through the detection of crop diseases, pests, and droughts. All these applications can quite simply revolutionize the world as we know it. With that, our second argument is the workforce. One of the largest concerns with AI is its effect on the labor market. Although AI replicates certain human tasks definitionally, this does not translate into unemployment, as humans can adapt and provide new roles for themselves in the global economy, something that has happened in every industrial revolution. Indeed, a World Economic Forum report from 2018 finds empirically, businesses that employ AI become more productive, allowing them to enhance the output of existing workers rather than replace them. AI will also improve educational outcomes. Online courses driven by AI can provide an affordable, precisionally targeted education to the underprivileged. For example, in India, Upgrad has enrolled 2,000 students in entrepreneurship, digital marketing, data analytics, and product management courses. By leveraging these educational opportunities, low-income individuals can acquire the knowledge they need to secure jobs that will be created by AI. AI has already been beneficial in a multitude of industries, from design software for engineers to virtual operative assistants for surgeons. and also holds non-specific uses for all businesses and people, like grammar checking software, natural language processing, and even virtual assistants like Siri or Cortana. In the past 10 years, the frequency of contributions from machines and algorithms to human-led tasks has increased over 57%. So what does this all mean for the workforce? Well, worker efficiency and output are set to increase drastically. A 2018 analysis by Bain & Company estimates that average worker output will increase by 30% due to automation by 2030. And a McKinsey report concludes that AI alone will increase in a 16% growth in global GDP by 2030, which equates to an additional $13 trillion of global economic activity. For these reasons, an international analysis of the impact of automation by John Hawksworth, the chief economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, concludes that AI and automation will lead to a larger and wealthier global economy and create enough jobs in the long run to offset the jobs lost in the short run. With that, our third and final contention is climate change. One of the key benefits of AI systems is the protection of our planet from the exigent dangers of climate change. To get a glimpse of how AI can help confront climate change, we'll start in agriculture. The Union of Concerned Scientists names 4 impacts that climate change will have on farms: floods, droughts, changes in crop viability, and pathogenic threats. AI reduces the unpredictability that arises from these issues. Through obtaining satellite images of weather patterns and views of harvest outputs, AI can help optimize farm output while climate change threatens it. According to a study done by the World Economic Forum, widespread use of AI-based agricultural methods could reduce farming costs by $100 billion by 2030, all while saving 180 billion cubic meters of water. But the impact of AI goes beyond farms. Omdana, an AI startup contracted by the United Nations, recently developed a system of support vector machines to monitor areas of droughts, floods, and violent conflicts resulting from climate change. This machine learning model helps optimize the allocation of utility personnel to handle climate-related incidents. Climate change disproportionately affects the world's most disadvantaged communities because they are the ones that lack the resources to adapt to it. The first comprehensive study from the Global Humanitarian Forum finds nearly 98% of people seriously affected by climate change come from these developing countries. It is very possible that climate change is the single most important issue facing the global poor, which is why it is imperative that we use machine learning and artificial intelligence, the 2 best skills, to help them. When we look at climate disaster projections, it's clear that a lack of intervention is doomed. The Institute for Economics and Peace explains that 1.2 billion people living in 31 countries are not sufficiently resilient to withstand ecological threats. Conventional technology will not save those billion lives, and negligence certainly won't do it either. AI systems, which have been shown to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions and environmental degradation, are our only way to withstand society's greatest threats, which is climate change. Climate change threatens the world's stability, and society's newest technological disruption is our best bet to combat it. As you can see, AI is not just humanity's newest invention. It is our greatest accomplishment. For the billions of people who will gain better access to education, work, and healthcare, for the people who will survive and thrive in climate change and beyond, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Thank you. We'll now have the opening speech from the Hockaday School. It's for 8 minutes. You may start when ready.
Making sure everyone can hear me again before I go. Okay, awesome. The world of the affirmative sounds like a good idea until the technology falls into the hands of those that wish to do evil. Their case takes on a utopian perspective of the world, and it is for these reasons that we're so proud to negate today's resolution. Let's go into some framework then. We agree this debate ought to be adjudicated on like the present harms and benefits, as well as like the reasonable future based on trends existent now. Let's go into that first argument then, which is about why AI is discriminatory. 3 reasons. First of all, AI is structurally racist and disproportionately harms women and people of color. Implicit biases of coders and technology developers means that the codes itself becomes racist. Sindhuha Ragurahan reports that nearly a third of these firms have no executive women of color and no Black employees. This is ultimately harmful because these individuals code their biases into their AI software, causing an entrenchment of racism that is harder to identify in the long run. Even if the workforce is perfect on their side of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition reports that historic data, such as policing practices that has disproportionately targeted Black Americans, is the foundation of what AI learns from. Therefore, the algorithms built on these systems, such as predictive policing, will inherently reinforce and perpetuate structural racism already prevalent within the status quo. Perhaps more concerningly, though, police officers such as the NYPD have been found to falsify data then used to train models, exposing how AI can be manipulated for an individual agenda. Third reason is about why we think also like Merriam-Vogel reports that AI systems that data create a feedback loop of bias that causes an exacerbation of racism over time, inextricable from the technology itself. Ultimately, AI has a large impact on sentencing decisions. According to an analysis completed by Julia Angwin and ProPublica concerning North Point, an AI software that is one of the most widely used assessment tools in America, Black defendants are 77% more likely to be shown as a higher risk of committing future violent crimes than white ones, ultimately enshrining racial stereotypes about crime rates among minorities within the criminal justice system. The minority groups are often see the system as illegitimate, and the use of AI only deepens that mistrust. These individuals are falsely arrested, criminalized, and have their entire lives ruined over the racism within a computer system that cannot be held accountable whatsoever. These tools act as a form of tech washing, where a veneer of objectivity covers mechanisms that perpetuate inequities within society. The second argument then is about how AI promotes global authoritarianism. Two reasons why. First of all, authoritarian regimes wield AI as an asset in oppressing their citizens. According to Stephen Feldstein, countries such as China and Russia utilize AI to search for dissenting opinions and tracking opposition groups, effectively censoring and debilitating their ability to criticize oppressive actions. AI makes authoritarian governance irreversible. The capability to control the public sphere is the sole reason authoritarian leaders are able to capture and retain pervasive power, because they silence the resistance necessary for change. Second reason, AI promotes disinformation by use of social media. Stephen Feldstein also reports that the algorithms used to distribute content promotes bots, trolls, and other forms of misinformation or government propaganda. While humans are subject to ethical concerns and are slower using these same patterns to achieve the same purpose, AI's precise efficiency allows dangerous actors to make cold, calculated decisions with little to no oversight. Additionally, the rise of deepfakes allows authoritarian governments to rewrite fact. Mitchell Wardrop explains that AI spreads its propagandic technology to the average user, influencing elections, promoting violence, and creating non-consensual pornography. What are the impacts? First, the brutal silencing and repression of people under the rule of authoritarian governments is a direct violation to rights to humanity and life guaranteed by the global community. There's no moral grounds that exist when AI is used in this egregious manner. Second impact, Nicholas Wright explains that individuals are likely to adapt their behavior to avoid flagging by this intelligence, destroying freedom of thought itself. People are no longer allowed to think and act with autonomy. Rather, they are guided into the hands of their oppressors, the government. The third and final argument for the negative is about privacy concerns. AI violates the privacy of individuals because the data can be used to identify individual habits, lifestyles, political beliefs, and movements. Databases of information collected without consumer knowledge ultimately come about. Clearview AI, for example, violated a law that forbids companies from using a resident's fingerprints or face scans without consent. Companies like Clearview AI have a clear profit incentive to ignore the ethics and create mass databases of billions of face prints entirely unbeknownst to those people, and offer paid access to that database to private and governmental actors worldwide. Two impacts. First of all, it violates the autonomy of people because living a life of fear is living no life at all. Second of all, on the impact of surveillance, Lola Fudulu shares the real and disproportionate harms of AI. In Detroit, security cameras using this technology over surveil public housing units within communities of color. When this technology is put in place to track minorities, misidentifying them as criminals, already abusive officials have the justification to engage in increased violence. Let's go on to the affirmative case then. Their first argument here is about healthcare. We tell you right now that this argument about healthcare isn't necessarily true. They try to tell you that AI can solve for every single disease, every single disease using this expedited drug development. But first of all, drugs have like these specific enzymes. They have to go through these clinical trials that take years and years and years. This OCD kind of this OCD drug that they bring up, for example, is still in the first phase of their clinical trial. We don't really think that the expedited manner that they try to tell you about with these drugs really is true, when in reality the only thing that AI tries to really do is like expedite that process of researching, and it doesn't really expedite that kind of access to expedite that access to communities. We think, second of all, this specific piece of evidence that they bring you within their first argument is made by Deloitte. This is literally a consulting company that wants to accrue business. They will obviously cherry pick and find the best hospitals to go to pick out the best data possible. In other words, we don't really think that something really adds up here, and we don't really think that it's a real and clear justification for why AI is really good. Using the affirmative's own example of cancer detection, AI systems often operate off of flawed data sets that overdiagnose tumors as cancerous. This exacerbates problems such as overtesting, overdiagnosis, and overtreatment, which can ultimately harm patients' health. This is especially important since the adverse effects of AI disproportionately fall on racial minorities, which the affirmative concedes. On to that second argument then about the workforce and essentially about the economy. First of all, we don't really think that AI can create any new employment because humans are not needed when AI can completely bypass human input in its niche. In the US alone, AI could automate 47% of jobs, exposing 70 and more than 800 million workers around the world could be replaced by AI by 2030. We think exclusively AI seeks to supersede human intelligence, and we think even in cases where AI creates new jobs, it prioritizes high-skilled labor at the expense of low-skilled workers. Finally, on the argument about climate change, we think that ultimately there are adverse harms here whenever this same AI that the affirmative tries to defend also increases the emission, because a single deep learning model can generate more than 626,000 pounds of GHG emissions. For all of these reasons,
Right.
so proud to affirm. Negate.
We'll have a 3-minute preparation period prior to second speeches. 3 minutes. Preparation time is over. We'll now have second speeches, starting with the affirmative for a period of 5 minutes.
All right, can everyone hear me clearly? All right, my time will begin now. The negative concedes that the long term is important in this debate. This is key because AI will combat one of the world's most pressing long-term challenges, which is climate change. If you believe that each of my opponent's arguments are true, then you should cast your ballot for the affirmative because climate change magnifies the issues they discuss on a much larger scale. For instance, let's look to discrimination. As we mentioned in constructive, climate change disproportionately affects marginalized communities and countries globally. In addition, if we look to authoritarianism, we've seen that climate change actually increases authoritarianism. For example, the Maldives, one of the countries most affected by climate change, saw its democracy fall as the economy stagnated due to negative effects of global warming. Finally, the warming climate causes crop yield to decrease because plants cannot survive under higher temperatures, which sparks resource conflicts. In fact, the UN finds that conflict has increased 5-fold in West Africa, isolating clashes between farmers due to pressure from climate change as a key cause. With this in mind, let's actually go down each of my opponent's arguments, beginning with the discrimination. There's a lot of problems with this. First of all, there are programs and organizations in place to expand diversity, such as Black in AI and Women in AI. Thus, in the long term, representation will not be a major issue, and representation of women and people of color in STEM is currently increasing, which just proves my point. Second of all, the discrimination they discuss is not inherent to AI. Rather, it is a byproduct of internalized societal biases. Even in a world without AI, the underlying factors that perpetuate racial and gender inequalities will still exist. Therefore, there is no net harm coming from AI. This is actually empirically supported. An analysis of arrest data over multiple years found that there was no difference in racial biases across stations that used predictive policing and those that did not. Third of all, AI is actually our best bet at combating discrimination. The negative's own evidence suggests that AI highlights racial biases within institutions. By making discriminatory decisions, algorithms can indicate the presence of pre-existing inequalities and biases. This not only spurs social reform, but it also allows for improved regulation. Already, organizations have formed initiatives to ensure that AI algorithms are unbiased. For instance, once IBM discovered the racial and gender bias within its facial recognition, IBM shut down its program entirely, and currently, research is being funneled into eliminating these biases. Generative adversarial networks, or GANs, are being used to train AI algorithms instead of human-created datasets. And these GANs create computer-generated faces that can generate diverse datasets with faces of all genders, ages, and races. Finally, AI would actually improve the justice system in the long term by reducing flawed human judgment. Currently, extraneous factors, such as how recently a parole member had lunch, can impact court decisions. Unfortunately, these factors lead to tougher sentences that disproportionately affect Black defendants. However, the NBAR concludes that if AI programs were used to guide decision-making for judges and juries, jail populations could decrease 42% without increasing crime rates. Now, let's move on to my opponent's second argument about authoritarianism. There's a couple problems. First of all, the use of AI for harmful surveillance will only decrease. Just 2 weeks ago, Politico released a draft of legislation from the EU that will ban uses of high-risk artificial intelligence systems altogether. And this regulation will have global consequences that cause changes in China. The EU's proposed rules will restrict or ban some uses of artificial intelligence, including by tech giants in China. And this is effectively an economic sanction designed by the EU against China. And in time, major Chinese tech companies like ByteDance will feel pressure to limit their contributions to China's harmful development of surveillance AI. Second of all, my opponents mentioned issues of like fact-checking, of false information, but AI can actually be used to do fact-checking, and it can also be used to determine whether something is deep-faked or not. Thus, AI is solving the problem that they themselves mentioned. Finally, companies and free states can actually use AI to identify and assist members of oppressed states and combat authoritarianism. For example, through working with NGOs, AI can be leveraged to optimize delivery of aid, supplies, and services to refugees and displaced people. And Microsoft is even working on a multilingual chatbot to understand the language of refugees and identify areas of needed support. Finally, let's move on to my opponent's argument about privacy. Although privacy is important, we believe that there are other rights that are much more important, such as security. If people aren't safe and alive, then no other right can be exercised, and we believe that the life-saving effects from AI certainly outweigh the harms to privacy. In addition, every human invention can be taken too far, and for that reason, it can also be regulated. AI is no different. When Clearview AI, I believe that's the example that my opponents even mentioned in their case, violated data privacy concerns by collecting unlicensed biometric data, they face lawsuits from the ACLU and investigations from the police department, which has deterred them from taking the same actions again. So these privacy violations will not be severe in the long term. Now let's go into some of their responses. All of their responses to healthcare missed the warrant of our case. They never disproved that AI allows for faster and better analysis of data, which leads to cheaper and more effective drugs. Even if the system is imperfect, it is far preferable to the status quo, and we've seen that already, where the drug development process was up to 5 times faster. On our second intention, they say that humans aren't needed, but humans are needed to explain AI, operate AI, and create AI, which is clearly disproves their argument. And finally, with regards to CO2, as the demand for AI increases, so too will the ability to store data more efficiently, which leads to lower emissions in the long term. For these reasons, please cast a ballot for the affirmative.
Have our second break for 3 minutes, followed by the second speech by the affirmative for 5 minutes. That's time. We'll now have the second speech by the negative team for a period of 5 minutes. You may begin.
Can everyone hear me? At the top of the affirmative second rebuttal, they tell you that climate change is the most important issue in this round. Ironically, climate change is a short-term problem, especially considering that the UN IPCC quantifies that there are only 10 years left before irreversible climate change. If you are voting off of climate change, then you're going to be voting off of the short-term impacts of climate change, given that we have a very limited time to reduce emissions. Considering that they did not respond to my teammates' arguments about how AI actually in their training models uses hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon emissions to even power these models in the first place, we are winning off of the climate change argument at the top. That's the unique reason to vote for us, because they weighted as the most important issue in this round. Given that they actively increase carbon emissions, especially given that just one model uses 630,000 pounds of carbon emissions, and even when you have these, and to train one singular model, you have to use over 4,000 of these models in the first place. They drastically increase the emissions we have. We are already winning this round at the top, and you can vote for us here. But I'm going to deal with the rest of the case now. Additionally, on the environment, not only that, we also win because major oil companies use AI applications to optimize oil drilling and increase fracking efficiency in prolific oil basins, as Greenpeace reports. At their best, they are non-unique. At their worst, they actively contribute to the dominance of the oil and gas industry in the energy sector. And that means that their world is far worse on the issue of climate change. On health, first dealing with diagnosis. Two responses. First, AI developed in diagnosis requires large amounts of data that are often biased. For instance, 14 studies found that Black patients were 40% less likely to receive pain medication compared to white patients. Additionally, second, AI is empirically proven to misdiagnose patients because researchers at Harvard and MIT reported that doctors, hospitals, and other organizations manipulate AI in billing or insurance software to maximize profit, changing the behavior of AI systems with tiny pieces of digital data, i.e. AI systems perceive illnesses that are not really there because doctors change a few pixels on a medical scan to gain more profits. Already they are carrying out these adversarial attacks by changing the data in AI systems, benefiting insurers and healthcare agencies at the expense of patients. They kill lives in their world. Third, another reason, algorithms are trained on the wrong things and they operate off of flawed data sets that overdiagnose individuals that have harmful side effects such as increased exposure to radiation and medical procedures that have their own dangerous side effects. This is really important since the adversarial health impacts disproportionately fall on racial minorities. That means that they get far worse on this question. On drug development, first, there's no impact because even though artificial intelligence has existed for 20 years, not a single drug has made it out of the clinical trial in the real world. They don't give you a reason as to why this is going to occur, but we'll give you a reason why it slows down. Since AI drug optimization is applied during preclinical phases, AI doesn't guarantee that scientists understand the nature of these drugs or that the drug will work, which only slows down the more tedious clinical trials of the development of the drug. That gets a lot worse in their world. But even if AI creates drugs more efficiently, the profits aren't carried down to the consumer because there's inelastic demand for medicine. They only increase the profits of pharmaceutical companies. On to our case. First, on discrimination. They tell you that they're going to care about the long term and how there's methods of diversification now. But the algorithms are created now. Considering that they conceded our analysis about how this creates a feedback loop of racism, they can never solve these problems in their world. Additionally, this is hard to fix for a few reasons. First, because AI is codified, there's no incentive to train away because there's a lack of algorithmic transparency, which means individuals do not know why they were denied jobs, refused loans, or put on no-fly lists through these AI, which means that there's no ability to check back on them. Additionally, AI is not understandable to the general public because they use algorithms that are intrinsic, and you can't just look at the code when you're a member of the public. That means that there's no ability to fix it. Additionally, there's a veneer of objectivity that exists, which means people just believe that AI is bias-free, considering that it's a machine. That means that no one ever thinks that this actually occurs. Notice, if AI is structurally racist, it's worse because they're not ever going to be able to solve the diversity claims that they told you about. On authoritarianism, they say that EU regulations are going to apply to China. I really don't understand this. I think China will still be able to use AI and things like the Great Firewall to continue to repress its citizens and much more efficiently and much more precisely that silences repression. This also applies to nascent democracies, and we think that means that this only gets worse on their side of the house. Considering that China already uses this to continue to repress Uyghur Muslims in China and actively carry out a genocide against them, we're far ahead on this question. Lastly, they concede privacy. We think this is really important because without access to privacy, you do not have access to the freedom of individuals, which we think you should outweigh. Proud to negate.
David, you're on mute.
About that. We're going to have a cross-examination period. It's important for everybody to remember, captains especially, that everybody needs to answer and ask one question. And then beyond that, we can pretty much keep this flow the way you want. It's for 10 minutes total. We'll start with an affirmative question to the negative, and then we'll move back and forth. Affirmative question for the negative.
Yeah, sure. So the negative, you say that AI systems that discriminate against people are not being held accountable. And then you have statistics to show the successes and failures of these AI systems, and so do we. Now, these statistics come from research papers where AI companies publish the variables that they use, the results of their models, and are thus judged by their peers and are forced to retrain those models. If information is being published and reactions are happening right now, how can you say that these AI companies and their models are not being held accountable? And how can you assume that their models are not improving?
Just because researchers are having academic debates about this doesn't mean that the general public who vote for politicians who then regulate AI understand these models, care enough about these models to vote on these issues, and 3, actually are willing to create these forms of like anti-bias in those ways. So you're never going to have A, the kinds of regulations that are done by governments that your side of the House wants, but additionally, these are always going to be seen as objective models, given the analysis we gave to you about how individuals see them as like objective because they are a form of technology that they do not fully understand. To that extent, all these harms get a lot worse in your world.
A question from the affirmative to the negative.
Right. Can you name one drug that has been approved and is on the market that has been developed solely using AI?
I'll take this question. So I think the biggest issue with this question that you keep asking, or the point that you keep making, is that you look at specifics, right? You try to make this argument that, oh, this OCD drug that you talked about hasn't made it into the market yet. The biggest issue with this is that all of our evidence talks about how this is a nascent domain. All of this drug innovation is recent innovation. Like, you are doing new protein modeling, doing new things to be able to create these drugs, which is why right now, obviously it hasn't made it out of the long trial period. But the biggest issue is that continually you have missed our warranting for why AI allows for better innovation in not only healthcare, but other sectors like climate change that goes continually conceded, which is that AI allows for the analysis of larger data sets more effectively, and that warranting and reasoning goes conceded the entire debate.
I want to add on to what my partner said by saying that AI is used in some capacity with every pharmaceutical company. It's just the extent to which it is involved in testing. For example, I have an autoimmune disease, so I take levothyroxine every morning. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are leveraged to take the evaluations of my blood test and to determine what dose I need. Beyond that, though, AI is already being used for many different drugs. The biomedical startup Helix is using AI to assist in testing of 4,000 FDA-registered drugs at once, and it has incredible success.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
All right, so let's talk about the issue of privacy. So you stress the importance of privacy, but as we already know, in the status quo, our privacy is quite limited. And that's because the government knows that security is important. We know that security is important. So privacy typically comes at the expense of security. So given that we're already being heavily surveilled in the status quo by organizations such as the NSA, my question to you is, how much worse is this privacy violation going to be? And how will this directly affect people compared to the status quo?
Right. So like this is the idea of, you know, what I told you within my first speech, a life of living in fear is living no life at all. Insofar as AI exacerbates and even worsens the privacy concerns because they're using and extrapolating data from people's private lives, we don't really think that the disproportionate harms are really worth it. Insofar as you have like this kind of idea of like those minute benefit that you might want to talk about in terms of like hypotheticals. We think that ultimately AI can analyze every aspect of people's lives, and we don't think that in the long run it's worth it if people have to live in fear for the rest of their lives.
And I'd like to add on to that the most vulnerable individuals are the ones that are being most violated from privacy through AI. For example, the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitations expressed concerns with being surveilled under AI, especially for domestic violence victims who don't want facial recognition features to expose them to their abusers.
Okay. Next question.
How long do we have to solve climate change?
Well, I think that there's a fundamental misportrayal of how the issue of climate change works, right? Climate change is a scalar impact, right? The more emissions we produce, the more worse warming gets, right? There's a study that shows that every 0.5 degree increase in global warming will lead to an additional 153 million deaths. And that just proves that as we emit more and more, in the long term, that will cause more and more consequences. So I understand your point that we have 10 years to quote unquote solve climate change, but that's not exactly how it works. That's 10 years to meet a certain threshold, maybe like the 2-degree threshold established by the UN. But the point is that if we can decrease emissions in the long term, we're preventing so many adverse consequences from occurring years down the line.
Exactly. And I want to add on to that by saying that not only is AI being used to stop climate change from happening, it is also being used to mitigate the effects of climate change. We talked about floods, droughts, and rising sea levels earlier. Those can all be assessed and evaluated by farms using AI methods. So even if climate change is already happening, which it is, AI can not only stop it from happening to some extent by limiting its effects, but it can also help us perceive what those effects are and make better decisions in agriculture and in every other sector.
Question from the affirmative for the negative.
Sure, I can ask a question. So I guess starting on the idea of privacy, right? So when you got up here in your rebuttal, I mean, your second speech, for example, you said that we can see this idea of private data being taken, but you yourselves give us the example of how AI and other private data collection is essentially being regulated by the government. And you tell us yourselves that this illegal act was later prosecuted by, for example, the ACLU. So if these intrusions on privacy are being regulated away, and these are just small examples that you find that in which AI might lead to some privacy like intrusions, how can you make this extrapolation that AI in general increases the privacy concerns for all people in a very meaningful way?
Right, so we think that there's two ways that privacy concerns are exacerbated by AI. The first way is data collection, and we think that regardless of regulations, companies that run AI know that they're going to profit more if they collect this data, and even if they do get regulations, it's just a fee that can be offset by the profit that they gain. The second way that AI abuses privacy is through the usage of AI, and we see this happening most under authoritarian governments, where we told you that 500,000 Uyghur Muslims were being tracked by AI under Chinese surveillance, which led them to being put in concentration camps.
Just to add on, even if AI systems are regulated, the thing is, AI companies now use this as the cost of doing business and just add that as an additional fee onto their profit margins. They still engage in the same forms of abusive like collection. They just like are willing to do that because they get more profits from collecting this data than they lose from getting regulations.
Okay. Question from the negative to the affirmative. Question should come from whoever hasn't asked one yet.
So you give us like this idea of how AI will ultimately bring about a lot of economic benefits in terms of like giving people different kinds of jobs. So like what kind of jobs specifically will come out of AI?
One job that can come out of AI is a data scientist job. These are jobs that are highly prevalent right now in Southeast Asia and in developing countries, because much of the information that can be used to learn how to become a data scientist can be learned through Quora, through Reddit, through Khan Academy, and through other online available sources.
Yeah, and just to add on to what Sharyar said, I know a negative team makes the same argument that essentially AI is out of reach for a lot of people that are quote unquote like underprivileged, right? But the biggest issue here is that if anything, the AI revolution does the opposite, right? So the first thing that we see is that the doubling of real wages, according to, I can cite this later, but a Forbes article that did an analysis of a lot of literature on this topic, right? So what you actually find is that the cost of production for all these goods decreases, which means on net, the underprivileged end up benefiting, right? But the second issue is that usually a lot of things require capital. These are barriers to entry for people to, for example, enter AI jobs or create AI businesses. The thing that is so good about this soft infrastructure that's needed to build AI is that you don't have to have a lot of capital to create an AI company or to program something. And that's precisely why there are so many large data centers and so many large AI innovations coming out of, for example, West Africa or even India, where there isn't that much infrastructure and not enough capital to build these huge mega corporations that you would see in other sectors.
Probably have time for one more question from anybody. All done? Okay. We will move on then to the judges' questions. This is a time period that will be about 30 minutes long, and we will ask the panel to direct questions to both teams. So we'll just get started with, I'll throw one out. How about a question for the affirmative from the panel? Anybody?
I can start.
Okay.
Thanks, affirmative. Just a question. So we were talking a little bit about earlier, kind of that AI could help potentially solve this issue of deepfakes, right? By actually predicting that there, or at least identifying that there was a deepfake. But then it kind of seems as though you guys are suggesting that, you know, there will always be an answer, right? It always find out what. But then if the AI knows that it's going to be discovered in that way, then it might change or adapt itself a little bit. And then the existing model doesn't work. And there's a time lag between the time that it identified that there was an issue and the time that it actually was identified as an issue and solved. So I guess my question to the affirmative is it good enough? Is that a good enough answer to say that there's always kind of this catch-up mechanism? Or does the negative have an argument here that exactly that time gap could potentially be the time that this disinformation is being cascaded and shared and could cause a revolution, could cause a protest, could cause a government to fall? So that's my question for you is that enough?
Yeah, so I think the reason why we respond to this, and a lot of the responses that we make to the neg are actually predicated on this idea of a new AI innovation called GANs, or General Adversarial Networks. So for example, the assumption made in the question is this idea that to be able to train something to detect deepfakes, you have to look at a bunch of deepfakes being made right now. The issue here is that AI has you can create your own data sets through the use of past data sets that can do the exact same thing. So for example, let's say company A is creating deepfakes. Company B can generate those same deepfakes using similar algorithms, for example, and then company B can add onto that the detection mechanism to train it on their own data sets. So company B is not reliant on company A, but rather they can create the data sets themselves and train the AI themselves, which is exactly why we tell you that AI data sets are becoming better and better and solving for things like bias and inefficacy.
Okay. Next question.
I have a question for the negative, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so the sort of top framing of the negative case in the second speech is about the important climate problems generated by AI. And I'm wondering if you have provided evidence on the net effect on emissions. I understand that training the AI certainly has substantial upfront emissions costs. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what your evidence says about sort of the medium and long-term emissions direction of AI.
Right, so what our evidence points to is that a single model requires like approximately 5,000 training models. So because there's like so many of those, and like each of these like models includes 630,000 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions. So when you add that up over time, that's a drastic cost on like the emissions like on the world that's going to be very damaging in our ability to solve climate change.
I guess I want to unpack that a little bit. I'm not totally sure I understand the scale of some of those numbers. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, obviously, 630,000 tons or whatever sounds like an extremely large number. How does that compare to the benefits achieved from AI, and what does your evidence say about that?
Right, so 630,000 pounds is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions of 5 cars. So considering you're using 5,000 of those models for one AI system, so that's like 2,500 cars being put in each time you use a singular AI model, if that helps to like quantify it in real world examples.
I'll be honest, that makes it seem like not that much to me. I'm thinking about, my block probably has 2,500 cars, or not 20, my block, my neighborhood probably has that many cars. If that is capable of achieving a pretty substantial benefit in terms of reductions in everyone's cars, reductions in the ability to predict, if my neighborhood is going to flood, or, if a particular country is going to need to do something with their food supply, why is that not worth that upfront cost? And again, I guess this is where the net direction is what I would love to see. And then I'll pose the same question to the affirmative, obviously.
So this is just like one model. There are millions of these models being used across the world. So quantify that like 2,500 times, like every single time AI is being used across the world, and that's where you see the huge effect on emissions.
But additionally, our opponents talk about how they're going to be using AI to develop these renewable energy sources and predictive modeling, which is going to help solve AI. But at the same time, you need to recognize that oil companies, fossil fuel companies are at the same time using these AI technologies. So they can talk about renewable companies using them, but they need to recognize that symmetrically, fossil fuel companies are at the same time exacerbating this on this side. So there's really no net gain on their side, but intrinsically, innately, AI produces emissions in and of itself without usage.
I appreciate it. Thanks. Affirmative, I'd like to sort of ask the same question. What does your evidence say about the upfront costs of training the AI in terms of emissions and the net direction of the effect that AI will have on GHG emissions globally?
I'm going to start by giving my answer and then open the floor to my partner to do it. AI contributes to greenhouse gas emissions via data centers. We have evidence to show that worldwide, data centers contribute 0.9% of the world's electricity usage, which means that the remaining 99% can all be modified and mitigated by climate change through optimization of fossil fuels or switching to renewables.
And in addition, I would like to add on something that we mentioned in healthcare. There was a quote that we used that says, the beauty of the algorithm is that it is agnostic, meaning that it can be applied to any disease. In a similar vein, AI can be used for any energy grade. So if there's one algorithm that's created, even if that produces the emissions of one car over its lifetime, that algorithm can be applied to an energy grade in the US, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe. It can be applied repeatedly. So overall, it magnifies the benefits that it creates, and that is enough to offset its harms. In addition, Jonathan, you can.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So just lastly, they talk about how AI is used by fossil fuel companies. But the most important thing to realize here is that AI is not used to further fossil fuel companies, which is why all 6 of the major fossil fuel companies are going towards instead green energy, right? You see Shell, BP making these huge investments. But rather right now, AI, for example, the collaboration between Amazon and BP is to decrease the waste and emissions released when doing things like drilling for oil, right? So these processes happen regardless of AI, but AI decreases the waste, it decreases the emissions, and on net, decreases the amount of global warming caused by these processes that happen with or without AI.
Okay, next question.
Can I ask a question that for both teams? So I'm struggling a bit with the uniqueness of this technology, and that's what I want to try to hear from both of you. Because what I'm hearing throughout the debate is I feel like you could take the word A out and just replace the word with technology for almost every argument. And it comes down to who's in control of that technology. Is it an evil corporation? Is it like a good-willed government? So I just feel like it's just competing claims of like if it's going to be used for good or ill, depending on who's in control of that specific technology. So I'm trying to unpack like what is the uniqueness of the technology and what does that mean to your side? Just not that more advanced technology can help with these or hurt these issues. Like what about AI specifically does that make sense? How like the uniqueness to your side of what I'm getting at? That's what I'm struggling with here. So I'd like to hear an answer from both Af and Neg if I can.
Okay, well, if it's all right, I'll go ahead and I'll start from my side. And if my partners want to add anything along, they can. So what makes AI different from every other form of computing software and anything is the fact that you can teach a computer to do something without teaching a computer how to do something. So to put that into perspective, instead of explaining to a model, give 1.2 weights to this variable, 3.6 weight to this variable. You throw a bunch of variables at it, you determine which ones are the most important, and from that, the computer will learn exactly how to react in the best possible way. Now, my opponents try to bring up this point about how people who have biases teach computers to use those biases. Well, when race variables are removed from those data sets, there is no way for people to teach a computer to simply be racist. The computer learns on its own.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, so our case is divided into 2 main categories. The first is this idea of innovative uses of AI. So we talk about things like pharmaceutical innovation, preventative care, and things like climate change predictions, right? This is something uniquely created by AI because we explain that AI obviously allows for better data analysis, just like what Sharyar said. By allowing it to learn on itself, right, AI is able to analyze larger data sets and more efficiently. The second category is the workforce, and this is pretty generic to every industrial revolution, if that's how you want to think about it, which is just that every time we've seen an industrial revolution, the quality of life increases. So for example, I'm sure our opponents can agree that like the reason that we are in this Zoom call and the reason we have things like personal computers or internet or even lights at home is because of different like innovations and technological innovations that have spurred obviously like very big transformations in the workforce that on net benefit all people.
Yeah. Okay, so 3 reasons that we've laid out to you so far. First of all, it's obviously like the algorithmic harms of AI because it creates this kind of feedback loop of bias. We don't really know, like AI is changing and developing as we speak right now, and we say that there's a lack of transparency that occurs with that because we don't have really any human involvement. It's just a bunch of executives within these technology companies that often are deprived of women and also people of color within their executive makeup that ultimately leads to that lack of transparency. We can't really train that bias or racism out of the AI when we have these same executives, doing this kind of work. We essentially told you about like how the code is essentially unclear insofar as we don't really have that much human involvement. The second part that we told you about was about like the efficiency of AI, right? It's because what the affirmative tells you about like why AI is so efficient, it can ultimately be used and wielded by authoritarian governments to ultimately crack down on dissidents and minorities that they don't see as like, their own citizens. That's what we see with China, where they've literally trapped over 500,000 Uyghur Muslims within concentration camps. We tell you this ultimately like exacerbates the harms. Like even without AI, authoritarian governments are already doing this harm. But we tell you that AI makes it even easier and even faster for the authoritarian governments to enshrine this kind of harm. We tell you the third and final reason is about like privacy is intrinsic in AI because data collection and because of data collection and algorithmic use. We don't really think that privacy can be like inextricably like detached from AI because it's just so intrinsic to the nature of the technology that ultimately disproportionately harms the lives of people and like what we told you about before.
Additional questions?
Yeah, let me kind of follow up on Trey's question here for a second. So towards the negative, is all AI bad? I mean, or should we have like 0.2% of the current AI, or is 80% of the current? When did we trip the wire? Like when did all hell break loose and authoritarianism started killing all of us? Like, or that hasn't happened yet because we haven't gotten to that level of AI yet. Help me a little bit in terms of this tripwire of when all of these harms started happening versus when they were not, and potentially more importantly, is there any level of AI that's okay for you?
Right, so we don't think there's any level of AI that is okay with us. And the primary reason for this is all of the problems that we've outlined, affirmative's response, we'll fix it, right? AI will adapt. That means that any problem that you see with AI, and we clearly have seen problems with AI, you have to fix them reactively, not proactively. That means as long as AI exists, there will always be harms that you have to chase, not harms that you can preemptively fix. And we think that those harms are uniquely most important because those harms are going to exist regardless.
Additionally, because AI is codified off of these like historical data that it's trained on, it trains on those harmful like pieces of like our past racist, our society is still racist, but like explicitly racist data that is then codified into these algorithms, and it creates the kind of feedback loop that we told you about. This has harms in like environmental racism, healthcare discrimination, all of these harms we outline also like trickle down into every like benefit that they tried to identify.
Right, and like we don't really think that the affirmative's idea of like this catch-up game is worth it insofar as like they have to continuously try and like quote unquote fix that technology when in reality the technology itself is flawed.
As a follow-up question, okay, understood. You can't have any AI. What do you think is the best answer then potentially to the affirmative's point that AI could be the next industrial revolution and create, I believe they said something like $13 trillion of GDP. What should we be working on? What would you propose should be kind of the next source of economic growth? Or is that benefit that the affirmative potentially is providing for, which is the next industrial evolution, too good to let go?
Yeah, so we actually think that like all of the benefits that they talk about, like industrial revolution, economic growth, are probably untrue. This probably just leads to mass unemployment. We'll read more stats on this in like the next speech. But I think additionally, the harm that exists here with AI means that like we can use traditional tech to create like a new industrial revolution. We can have like forms of medical research that find cancer drugs. I don't think that AI is like the only solution that exists for problems that exist in society. It just slows them down, makes them more expensive, and limits our ability to solve like climate change in the first place. We think like all of their benefits at best are non-unique and like have all of the ills that we talk about.
I have a question for the affirmative, if that's okay. So it seems like a major portion of the negatives argument is that initial coding errors get baked in and the feedback loop generates more bias over time rather than less bias. And I guess I'd be curious you've sort of said the opposite, that this gets fixed over time. I'd love some comparative evidence or some description of, how some of these things have actually gotten removed in real world circumstances, and then apply that as well to sort of the authoritarian government situation. But I can ask that as a follow-up if need be. Go ahead.
Sure. So 2 of the 3 members of our team have actually done AI research before, and we'll both tell you that before AI is deployed, it has to go through a training set, a testing set, and a cross-validation set to make sure that it is ready for the real world and that it is not just making assumptions off of data sets that aren't good assumptions in the real world. I'll give an example of a time where AI was actually found to be what some would call discriminatory, but really just a little bit, problematic, which was when AI was found to give less medical care to some groups in risk assessments because the authors of the AI model used annual healthcare spending as a metric that determines healthcare need. Once they decided afterwards, when they looked at it, that this wasn't a good metric, they were able to create a new model, close out all the model's impacts in healthcares, and they found that although this wasn't the vast minority of the time that AI was deployed, they were still able to find the problem, fix the problem, and teach how they learned from their mistakes to next generations of AI data scientists and beyond.
And if I could quickly add, I think the best comparative here is between AI and humans, right? Which one is more discriminatory? Because things like predictive policing, if you don't have AI, police decide where to go, right? They make the same decisions. And the most important comparative to make is that with AI, you can erase data sets. You can choose, oh, maybe this parameter wasn't the best, and change it in your next model. With people, you can't erase their minds, their preconceived notions, and the prejudices that they have baked into their minds, right? With AI, you can change the problematic issues and replace them with new data sets. For example, if we know that police encounters, for example, in the 1960s or 1970s, were extremely non-representative of certain races, you can choose not to include those pieces of data within your research, right? And you train it on new pieces of data. And again, we tell you new innovations like the general adversarial network allow for even more data sets to be created that are a lot less problematic, which solves back to the issues they talk about.
Okay, then I'd like to sort of ask you to apply some of this to the authoritarian governments argument. It seems like authoritarian governments, you're giving them an extremely effective tool for maybe the motive for the repression exists, but they do not have the means to track individuals on a where do they live, where are they going, that kind of thing, facial recognition, in terms of tracking people's movements and that sort of thing. Why should we give authoritarian governments that power?
Of course. So I think this actually ties in really well to Judge Trey's previous question about the question of uniqueness. And if we look at both worlds, a world with AI, without AI, every single problem that the negative discusses was pre-existing. For example, these racial biases, China's oppression of the Uyghurs, all of these problems were very, very severe. And if we didn't have any new solutions, these problems would only propagate and get worse. China would continue oppressing the Uyghurs. Police departments would continue to be racist. But the key here is that AI has the potential to overcome these issues. For instance, we've seen these general adversarial networks that create not flawed data sets that AI algorithms can train on to become more effective. And although there may be concerns with AI getting into the hands of the wrong people, I believe that in the status quo, the history has shown that whenever these bad actions come to fruition, there's always an actor that's going to take action to combat it. For example, new regulations from the EU to combat China's oppression of the Uyghurs. There's always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be a response to it as well.
My understanding is that the EU regulations are mostly corporate regulations and the way data can be used within the EU. Can you tell me what you think the EU regulations are going to do to stop China oppressing the Uyghurs within their own country?
Yes, so some of the EU regulations apply to Chinese companies that supply the China government with the resources they need to conduct this harmful surveillance of people and use it in their algorithms to oppress Uyghurs. So if there are restrictions on them, they'll supply Chinese government with lots of these resources. And as a result, that will hinder their capability to actually oppress.
Yeah, so I think the idea that Alex is trying to get to is just that essentially this functions almost like a sanction, right? So these companies like ByteDance or other companies that come from China that want to expand into international markets, they can no longer do so because of this essential sanction, right? So for example, you can't operate in the EU if you're doing things in the mainland, like for example, allowing for the oppression of Uyghurs. But also something I wanted to add on to with what Alex said before is that this oppression is very, very long-term, right? It's been happening for a very long time, but something that we've uniquely provided as a benefit is that AI has allowed for NGOs and government agencies to do things like benefit those that are being oppressed. So for example, they can do things like protect refugees when they come out of China and protect them when they go to, for example, flee to somewhere like Turkey, right? And this has historically been a very good solution and has helped a lot. And the thing is, like, we would say that things like genocides and other terrible actions, they have happened for a very long time. But what we've shown is that AI allows for some of the world's like foremost actors. So for example, like the United States or EU to be able to act upon the things that they want to stop. So for example, decrease the amounts of like oppression against Uyghurs by aiding the refugees and helping them get out of those like areas.
More questions? We don't have to use all our time. If you don't have any other questions, we can move on. But if you do, we've got time.
Maybe another question. Sorry for the affirmative. Maybe a comment from the negative. That's okay, David.
Sure.
So sorry, just to pick up on this point again. What we're saying, and I'm just going to make an analogy here. So as Alex was saying before, these problems already existed before AI came in. But let's say that previously we had access to like sticks and stones, and we were able to throw sticks and stones. And what you're saying is that the advent of the machine gun, we shouldn't try to like, stop the machine gun creation. No, we should create better bandages and like ways to remove the bullets from inside of the bodies after they've already been shot into the Uyghur Muslim population of China. Or as Jonathan is saying, is that hopefully if they've been removed from that area, then we can also take care of them. Affirmative, are you saying that everything can be solved and we shouldn't be trying to remove the machine gun from production, but we should just try to solve everything else? Is there no need to adapt the machine gun? Or potentially prevent it from being created in the first place?
Yeah, so I guess I can try to clarify this and then my partners can expand if they want to. I think the idea here is we're arguing that not only did like, you're telling me that like before it was sticks and stones, now is machine guns. Our argument is that the systematic oppression that occurs in all these countries, it wasn't a sticks and stones before, right? We saw huge genocides, things like the Holocaust or like the Rwandan genocide that were really, really bad. And it's very clear that genocides are not unique to AI. Even if you can conduct more surveillance, for example, genocides, if anything, were like really, really bad historically as well, right? So what we're telling you is that machine guns to machine guns, it's better if we have better medical care, I guess, in your analogy, if we have better protection against those machine guns and we allow for people to escape from those machine guns by helping the refugees than not doing anything at all.
Yeah. So if you have enough people in a small group together, does it matter whether you have a machine gun or regular gun or stones? If you have enough power over a group of people like China does over the Uyghur Muslims who live in the Northwest Territory of China, they will be able to kill them regardless. If anything, it's possible that because of AI, China has limited its killings of people who weren't Uyghurs, who they would have otherwise thought were Uyghurs and would have killed. The difference between AI and a machine gun is that with AI, we can actually solve the problems that have been happening with Uyghurs for a long time. Take a look at AI for Humanitarian Action, a 40 million partnership between Microsoft and the United Nations General Assembly. This has been used to create chatbots to speak with refugees who have crossed borders, deliver aid, and do all of these other things. AI isn't the machine gun, it's the machine.
I have one quick question because I keep hearing really good examples on both teams about the potential of this technology in the hands of like the powerful, of corporations, of governments. I haven't heard much about what is the potential of this technology in the hands of an everyday sort of person, right? And so we see that with the internet, technological revolution and social media, right? But what is the equivalent of that with AI, and is there? And that's kind of for both teams.
So I mentioned earlier that two of us had done AI research in the past, and I guess I could elaborate on that now since we are as close to regular people as you can have in the AI sector. So in my first summer of working with AI research, I actually used it for Parkinson's diagnosis. I of course wasn't able to get data sets on images by myself, but I worked with a professor at the University of Maryland. We were able to access that data. And the way that I learned about how to do it wasn't through a class or anything. I used online forums, I chatted with people from across the globe, and that's how I got into it. Beyond that, though, AI can be used for things like marketing in the day-to-day world. That's the way it can be used paired with the internet. People want to know exactly how much they should charge for their products. In fact, one time last year I was helping this painter who was enrolled at a nearby college try to figure out how much he should charge for his paintings. And I suggested he should find a data set of anonymous prices and use that to try to figure out what the optimal price is so that he could sell as many as possible.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on a little bit about the research I did. So mine was pretty different from Shahriyar's research, but essentially I created a machine learning model that looked at images taken from a car driving down a road. And basically it used the data from that car in order to predict distances from images. So given an image of anything, my model can predict how far each pixel is from the source of the camera. And of course, this has significant applications in a variety of industries. For example, self-driving cars, right? In order for cars to actually drive, they have to be able to perceive distances from objects on the road, such as stop signs, pedestrians, traffic cones, right? And that in turn allows them to make the correct decisions. And in the instance of self-driving cars, these can actually be game-changing across the world because a lot of human error, falling asleep behind the wheel, is a cause of a lot of car accidents. And if we have machines being able to make decisions without requiring humans to be fully attentive, that could reduce so many unnecessary deaths. And it could also optimize the route that cars take to different destinations, which could also decrease greenhouse gases too.
Negative, would like for you to respond to this.
Right. So we think the answer is threefold. First, if we look at our opponent's response, a lot of their applications of AI and everyday technology required knowledge of this technology in the first place. For example, them talking about using this technology in labs and developing data for pricing for artworks, right? We think that what this means then is that corporations and governments will always have the most power and the most accessibility when it comes to this technology, because everyday citizens first do not understand the technology in the first place, and second, don't have the funds and the resources to develop this technology. But even further, what we actually see this being used in everyday use when that does happen is, like, for example, we answered a previous question about privacy, and we talked about domestic violence victims, right? We told you that stalkers and abusive partners can use these systems to track their victims without them being able to change their names and addresses like they usually would to share their real whereabouts, because this AI technology leads to more facial recognition technology, it leads to more data collection. We think that's what it looks like when we talk about everyday usage of AI, and we think that's very problematic.
It also looks like workplaces using AI to determine who they should hire, who goes on no-fly lists, etc., which means that all of our impacts about how this disproportionately falls on racial minorities and gender minorities means that all of these implications end up harming everyday citizens the most.
We have, well, I think I'm muted. No, I'm not. We have about a minute and a half left. If somebody's got a quick question that doesn't require a lengthy answer, we'll take that on. Judges, anybody? No? Okay. We're wow. I just got a white screen. Now everybody's back. All righty, well then we'll move on to the, thank you. That was very helpful, it's very good. Both teams did a great job. We'll now move on to the final rebuttal speeches. We'll start with the affirmative, which has, or is it negative? It's negative, right? Yeah, we'll start with the negative. And your speech, your final speech will be 5 minutes in length. Let me get my thing set here. You can start when you're ready.
Hi, sorry, I think our Wi-Fi cut out a little bit, but
You're fine.
great.
We got you again.
Wait, sorry, just to clarify, can everyone hear me okay?
We can, yes.
All of the affirmatives' responses to the harms was that they could fix it over time. They took a reactive approach, but not a proactive approach, and this lost them the round. By the time you fix the problem, it's all too late. You've already put 500,000 Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. You've already put the cost of 5 cars per, emissions of 5 cars per AI machine in the air. You've already had individuals that are being tracked by their abusers that are believing in deepfakes. This lost them the round we're so proud to negate. In this speech, I'll be addressing a few clashes that summarize the three paths to the ballot that you'll be taking in today's round. So the first path to the ballot in the first clash is on privacy. We think that privacy is a very important argument in today's round because notice that the affirmative side really conceded these warrants to privacy, right? Because privacy is first innate in the technology and the data collection used for AI, but second is abused during its usage. But why does privacy matter above all else, even if we lose every argument throughout this round? Because first, no matter what country an individual lives in or what government runs it, an individual's degree of autonomy is one of the most intrinsic rights granted to us. For an individual to lose such rights to the government is a loss of freedom, loss of free thought, and a loss of free will. But second, they talk about this sense of security versus privacy and how oftentimes security outweighs privacy. But notice, privacy is a prerequisite to safe security because living a life of fear is living no life at all. You never have security because you never have a feeling of feeling safe when you're being tracked by the government and by your abusers. But notice that privacy is the gateway to all other rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. We think that this is critical in today's round. Let's go on to the second clash of today's round, which is about vulnerable individuals. What did we tell you? We told you this argument about bias. The only responses we heard was that it could be used to combat bias, but this link relied on the fact that AI was not biased in the first place. Given that AI currently has biases that we can see in the status quo, why can it never be retrained? 2 reasons. First, because as Naz and Mia have told you throughout this entire round, there is a veneer of objectivity when it comes to AI technology. That means that people believe that it's objectively true because it's something that they never fully understand, which means that they never have the incentive to retrain this data. But second, finding the cause of bias is nearly impossible in these chains of code because humans cannot fully understand it. Algorithms necessarily supersede human intelligence, and that means that we'll never be able to retrain these biases. And during the questioning period, our opponents talked about how, it's not like the precedent for biases in AI is like not that extreme, but it's a little bit problematic, right? And we think that this is very bad thing to say because just because these abuses occur in the status quo doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about it if it gets worse under AI. So let's talk about this issue about humans versus AI, right? The biases that humans have versus the biases that AI have. First, we can account for biases in human. We can hold people that are problematic accountable in the status quo. But the reason why this is unique to our side of the house is because when you have a veneer of objectivity, people don't hold AI accountable because they don't think the problem exists. But second, predictive policing means racist police officers use racist AI to continue to justify brutality that only entrenches their beliefs and makes it worse. But third, these same humans with these predetermined biases are the coders and technology developers enshrining and codifying their racism into technology that creates
further power dynamics. But then we gave you this argument about authoritarianism, right? Their only true response was about EU regulations. Notice that EU regulations will never have full control over these Chinese companies that operate solely in China, because companies care more about China than give them subsidization. But even if that doesn't happen, notice that their side of the house is chasing the problem rather than proactively addressing it, because AI surveillance has already caused 500,000 Uyghur Muslims to be caught and put in concentration camps. Then they talk about like these deepfake arguments, right? Notice that generative adversarial networks, or GANs, are made of two competing AI systems, have made it virtually impossible for even the most sophisticated AI to catch deepfakes. But most importantly, what is unique to our side of the house is nascent democracies turn into algorithm governments. But necessarily, this was a prerequisite, because there's no possibility for their benefits like healthcare, like climate change, to reach the people living under authoritarian governments. Rural China doesn't have access to the same healthcare that urban areas in America and other Western democracies have, because of the authoritarianism that exists. But further, we've already proved to you why we increase emissions in the short term. And what was most important in today's round was climate change in the short term, because we can't reach that tipping point. They conceded that argument, and that less than 10 years we need to solve climate change before it becomes irreversible. This equates to 25,000 cars worth of emissions per AI model that is used. But most importantly, as we've shown you today, the harms are worse than the benefits. We're so proud to negate.
Okay, before I begin, can I get a quick indication everyone can hear me well? Okay, then if everyone is good, my time will begin now. The most important thing that goes unresponded to this entire round is the creation of general adversarial networks. GANs are a solution to the bias our opponents talk about. By using GANs, AI can produce unbiased data sets, and they can test these data sets, make sure they are unbiased, and make sure they are effective. This is key because it solves for every single one of the arguments they make, things like privacy, for example, and things like biased data sets, right? Again, because you don't have biased data sets, you don't have things like the targeting of specific racial minorities. Because you have the ability to generate your own data sets, you don't have to intrude on privacy. You can use more rudimentary data to produce larger extrapolations, and you don't have to collect all this data in the first place. Remember, we talked about this at least 4 different times throughout the debate, and they don't choose to respond to it a single time. That's a pretty clear indication that we're winning here. But then let's talk next about this idea of oppression. The most important thing to realize is that oppression, again, like we said throughout the debate, has been occurring for a very long time. For example, the Uyghur genocide is a it is rooted in history, right? It's been happening for a very long time. Regardless of AI, you're going to see these genocides occur. But here are a few differences provided by AI. First of all, AI provides one of the only solutions to things like genocides, which is providing aid and intervention. The only way to stop things that were really bad, things like the Rwandan genocide, or for example, rescue the people who were in concentration camps during the Holocaust, would have been through having AI and being able to know how to target these people and these refugees. We tell you that AI provides this unique benefit and is the only solution, and that goes unresponded to. But the second thing, and another critical thing that goes unresponded to, is climate change. The concession made is again damning for the negative, because what we tell you is that climate change and its effects are being mitigated specifically by AI. The concession is made, they don't provide a single response other than this emissions thing, which I'll get to in a bit. We tell you that on net, AI prevents these people from becoming climate refugees, and this prevents authoritarian regimes, extremely oppressive regimes, and things like genocides from occurring. Because again, the evidence that we read in Case and this entire debate has told you that climate change results in things like increased oppression, because it allows for strongman leaders to gain power and continue oppressing people and scapegoating specific minorities. This is key because this provides a net negative again for the net, a net positive, because AI is the only solvency to stop this entire fall towards authoritarianism from previously democratic regimes. Their only argument on this topic of authoritarianism is just that AI and programs allow countries to move towards more authoritarian means, but again, they don't provide warranting. And we would say if anyone's buying surveillance technology from China, for example, to oppress their citizens, they're probably already authoritarian. At that point, we're saying that we're winning on authoritarianism and oppression, but the most important argument that we make are things like innovation and the revolutionization of the workforce. What goes conceded this entire round again is that we tell you that AI is providing the next industrial revolution. And every single time we've seen an industrial revolution, we see an increase in the quality of life. We see millions of people lifted out of poverty, and even the people who are the most worst off are on net benefited by these technological innovations. Even if AI takes away some jobs, they concede the John Hawksworth analysis, an international analysis across all nations that finds that on net, economies become richer and allow for less poverty when there's AI that is a lot more productive. This is key because we tell you that revolutionizing this in itself, for example, decreases things like authoritarianism and oppression, because what we've seen historically is that usually things like genocides and things like authoritarian regimes arise when there are crises. For example, you scapegoat a certain minority. That's how things like the Holocaust happened, right? And things like the Rwandan genocide, where constant conflict is a result of resource wars and other things like that. By allowing for increased prosperity and decreased crises, we are the best solvency for things like authoritarianism, because we decrease the things like scapegoating that result inevitably in oppression, and that is the root cause, while our opponents don't talk a single time about the root causes of these issues, but rather say that AI might exacerbate them to some extent that they can't quantify. Last of all, let's talk about medical innovation. This again goes unresponded to at the end of the day, which is really, really important because we tell you AI is allowing for new advancements in medical innovation. It is 15 times faster in some cases than developing drugs on your own. And we tell you that this is really critical because 40% of the total increase in life expectancy globally from a study period of 14 years came from drug development. Imagine how much life expectancy increase we would see from AI that accelerates this pace by 15 years in a world where we are continually seeing less and less medical innovation. It's very, very clear that at the best, our opponents say that we might slightly exacerbate some issues. We provide new solutions and we provide new innovations that help to solve these back and also do much, much more. And that's all conceded because they don't respond to pretty much any of our contentions at the end of the debate. Therefore, we strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Oh, I think you're muted.
You're right. Sorry about that. Congratulations on completing the semifinal debate. At this time, we'll take 10 minutes